In this second unit, or period of church history that we'll be looking at this week, week number 2, we'll be looking at units 7 through 13, which cover the periods from the 3rd century through the 5th century of the church. And this is a truly exciting time of church history when Christianity comes into its own. It becomes the favored religion of the Roman Empire and begins to really develop itself definitively in terms of theology. In Unit 7, then, we'll talk about the period just before Christianity is accepted in the Roman Empire. And this, unfortunately, for Christianity is a period of intense persecution. Traditionally, church historians say that there were 10 major persecutions of the church, beginning with Nero in the year 64 and ending with the Great Persecution, which ends in the year 311. Almost all of these persecutions were local in nature. And then something changes in the year 250. And this year we get the first empire-wide persecution of the Christian people. It only lasts for a couple of years, but it was shocking that it took place all throughout the empire. And then we get the Great Persecution that takes place between the years 303 and 311, where Christianity was really hard-pressed in many places, even for survival. And then everything changes. Christianity, or the Roman Empire rather, gets its first Christian emperor, Emperor Constantine, who the following year, in 311, promulgates the Edict of Milan, which allows not just for toleration of Christians, but true freedom for Christians. And slowly he himself becomes a Christian. So that Constantine then not only is the emperor of the Roman Empire, but he's a kind of titular head of the church. Up until this time, up until Constantine, Christianity consisted of regional organizations. But now that the emperor himself has become a Christian and sees the religion of Christianity as something that can be a support or a foundation even for the unity of the empire, this suggests that Christianity can no longer be simply regional. It has to become an empire-wide religion. And so then we see then under Constantine the effort to unify the theological thought of the church. And now we move on then to Unit 8, which focuses on the Council of Nicaea. This occurs in the year 325, and it's the first ecumenical council in the history of the church. It produces what eventually will be called the Nicene Creed. And it's the church's first effort to create a creed, a theology that will unify all of the people who are Christian within the Roman Empire. One of the reasons for this creed is that the church, now that it had become empire-wide and was communicating better amongst itself, had produced 2 schools of thought about the nature of the divinity and the humanity of Christ. These two schools of thought are Arianism, which suggested that Jesus was originally simply a human being whom God adopted as his son, and the position of Alexander, who argued no, that Jesus had always been God who became man. This is a debate within the church that had been going on actually for some time, but it's certainly highlighted in the first couple of decades of the 4th century. And then it would have been nice if it had been settled at the Council of Nicaea in 325. But actually the debate will continue then, even throughout the rest of this century. In Unit number 9, then, we continue this theological controversy, what we could call the Christological controversy of the 4th century and the first half of the 5th century. Much of this will seem erudite to you and narrow and unnecessary to understand, but it was absolutely essential that the church get this theology right for the unity of the empire and for the sake of simply getting the theology right for all future generations. And so the best minds of the church then, for the next 125 years, are focused on this one issue. How do we understand the nature of the Trinity? And how do we understand the unique position of Jesus as both fully God and fully man? By the end of this period, with the Council of Chalcedon in 451, three different positions within the church emerged, which continue to be controversial to this day. The first we could call pro-Chalcedonian, that is, those who accepted the formula or the definition of Chalcedon, and this is the position that would be accepted by the Roman Catholic Church and by the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is the position that's accepted today by all the Protestant churches. But two other positions also emerged, the Monophysite position and the Nestorian, or what sometimes today is called the Assyrian position. Those who are in the Monophysite tradition dislike the word Monophysite, and understandably so. It's an oversimplification of their position. It might be better to refer to them as anti-Chalcedonians. The Nestorians take an even more nuanced view. So this unit then will look at these three different positions. I've attempted in this unit to be even-handed and describe them, but I recognize that they're very controversial. You may or may not agree with how I've attempted to describe them. We'll discuss them together then in the online conversation that we'll have. In Unit 10, we move on to something that's probably nearer and dearer to our hearts, and that is Christian devotion. What did the worship service look like in the early centuries of the church? What were the first sacraments of the church? How was baptism understood? How was the Lord's Supper understood? These are also things that emerge in this time period, especially in the 4th century. In Unit 11, we come to the rise of monasticism. This is something that's particularly important to Egyptians because it's primarily in Egypt that we see the emergence of monasticism. One way to understand this emergence is that it is a reaction to the success of Christianity. As Christianity was increasingly adopted by Romans within the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the church became much more worldly. Bishops dressed much more elaborately. They took on greater roles of responsibility within the civil environment in which they operated. Many people were joining the church for all the wrong reasons, for social advancement, for political advancement, and so forth. So monasticism then is a reaction against this worldliness. Monasticism precedes this Constantinian church of the 4th century. But it's only in this 4th century that it truly becomes a popular, widespread movement. And essentially it emerges out of Egypt for reasons that we'll look at. Something to consider as we think about monasticism is whether or not it's another way for the old heresy of Gnosticism to re-enter the church. In one of the last units we looked at, we talked about heresies within the church. And you read about the Gnostic movement, this idea that the world is essentially evil. Did this idea re-enter the Christian thinking, the Christian community, through the monastic movement? I leave that as an open question for you to consider. And lastly, in Units 12 and Units 13, we will look at the life and the thought of Augustine. Augustine emerges as a great intellectual leader of the church at the end of the 4th century, the first 3 decades of the 5th century. He summarizes all of the Christian theology of the Roman Empire that had been developing for the last 300 years. He summarizes that for his time period, but also he summarizes it for the Middle Ages. So Augustine will be considered the great theologian of the Catholic Church, because of the emphasis that he puts on the essential nature of the church. And he will frame the argument. He will frame the debate amongst the theologians that will come for 1,000 years that follow him. Augustine is also considered the great theologian of Protestantism, because he is the theologian not only of the church, but of the idea that Christianity is essentially a relationship based on grace between humanity and God. And so he becomes the most influential theologian for Luther, for Calvin, for others of the great reformers of the 16th century. Augustine then is the father of both Catholicism and of Protestantism. But which Augustine is it? There are different Augustines, different ways of looking at him and interpreting him. So I'm giving you two full units on Augustine. The first one will talk about his life, and here I'm focusing on his book, The Confessions, where he talks about his spiritual journey, his journey from paganism, from a belief in Greek philosophy, through Manichaeism, and finally to faith in Jesus Christ, and how that came about in his life. In the second unit, and the last unit for this period, Unit 13, we'll look at the theology of St. Augustine. St. Augustine was not a systematic theologian. He was a theologian that dealt with the issues that were at hand, but he dealt extensively with them. He dealt with them in a way that's timeless. Thank you.